The arrest that shook the streets. In the heart of bustling downtown, the day began as usual. The streets of the city pulsed with life. People hurrying to their destinations, buses groaning to a halt, and street vendors calling out to pedestrians with tempting offers. Among the flow of morning commuters, Marcus Reed strolled calmly, an anchor of composure amid the storm of city chaos. At 35, Marcus carried himself with the assurance of someone who had achieved much, but wore his accomplishments lightly. He was dressed impeccably in a tailored navy blue suit, a white shirt crisp as fresh snow, and a tie that added a dash of color to his polished appearance. Every detail about him seemed intentional, from his neatly groomed beard to the shine on his shoes. Marcus was a man who valued excellence and precision, not for vanity's sake, but because he believed in presenting his best self to the world. The staff at Louis' Diner always knew to expect him around 8:00 a.m. on Fridays. His usual order, scrambled eggs, turkey bacon, and a side of fresh fruit, was always waiting for him the moment he sat down. It wasn't just the food that kept him coming back. It was the sense of familiarity, the warm greetings from Louis, and the genuine smiles from the servers who appreciated his generous tips. After breakfast, Marcus exited the diner, checking his phone as he made his way to his sleek black sedan parked on the street. A message from his mother popped up. "Don't forget dinner tonight, 7 p.m. sharp." Marcus chuckled and typed back, "Wouldn't miss it for the world. Love you, Mom." Just as he slid his phone back into his pocket and opened the car door, he heard the sharp blare of a police siren. Startled, he turned to see a patrol car screech to a halt beside him. Two officers, Mitchell and Blake, stepped out. Their demeanor was stern, almost confrontational, as if they had already decided something about him. "Sir, we need to ask you a few questions," Officer Mitchell barked, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. Marcus froze, his calm exterior concealing the churn of unease bubbling inside. "Of course, officer. What seems to be the issue?" he asked, his voice steady but cautious. "We received a report about a man matching your description involved in a theft in this area," Officer Blake interjected, his tone sharp. Marcus raised his eyebrows in surprise. "I believe there's been a mistake. I just had breakfast at the diner down the street. Louis and his staff can vouch for me." Mitchell stepped closer, scrutinizing Marcus with a gaze that felt less investigative and more accusatory. "ID. Now." Keeping his movements slow and deliberate, Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved his wallet. "Here you go," he said, handing over his driver's license. The officers studied the ID, but their expressions didn't soften. Instead, Mitchell handed it to Blake with a skeptical glance. Blake nodded, signaling agreement, and suddenly Mitchell's tone shifted from questioning to commanding. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Mitchell ordered. Marcus blinked, stunned. "Excuse me? On what grounds?" "We'll explain downtown," Blake said curtly, stepping forward to cuff him. A small crowd began to gather, whispers spreading like wildfire. Phones were pulled out, and people started recording. Some in the crowd murmured in protest, recognizing Marcus as the well-dressed man they often saw around the neighborhood. "This is a mistake," Marcus said, maintaining his composure even as he felt the cold metal of the handcuffs bite into his wrists. "I haven't done anything wrong." "We'll see about that," Mitchell said with a smirk, steering Marcus toward the patrol car. As the crowd's murmurs grew louder, Marcus caught sight of Louis, the diner owner, rushing out. "Hey, what's going on here?" Louis shouted. "This man's been here all morning." Mitchell turned to Louis with a dismissive wave. "Step back, sir. We're handling this." Louis didn't back down. "Handling what?" "Marcus is a regular here. He couldn't have done whatever you're accusing him of." But the officers ignored him, shoving Marcus into the back of the patrol car and slamming the door shut. As the car sped away, Marcus gazed out of the window, his mind racing. He was no stranger to the sting of prejudice. But this felt different, brazen, deliberate, and deeply personal. At the station, Marcus was led through the sterile halls, the stares of officers and staff burning into him. He was placed in an interrogation room, the walls bare except for a single mirror that he knew was two-way glass. The air was thick with tension, but Marcus maintained his composure. He had nothing to hide. Mitchell and Blake entered the room, tossing his wallet and phone onto the table as if they were incriminating evidence. "Care to explain why your ID doesn't match the description of the suspect we're looking for?" Mitchell asked, leaning over the table. Marcus met his gaze with unflinching calm. "That's because I'm not your suspect. I've done nothing wrong." Blake crossed his arms, his smirk almost mocking. "Well, until we sort this out, you're staying here." Marcus sighed, his frustration mounting. "Do I need to call my lawyer?" Mitchell's smirk faltered for a moment. "You can call whoever you want after we finish questioning you." The minutes dragged into hours. Marcus asked for water, for a phone call, for clarification on what exactly he was being accused of, but his requests were met with dismissive replies or silence. It was clear the officers were not interested in truth. They were interested in asserting power. Meanwhile, back in the neighborhood, word of Marcus's arrest spread quickly. Videos of the incident circulated on social media, sparking outrage among those who knew him. Louis took to his own social media, demanding answers and calling for justice. By noon, hashtags like #JusticeForMarcus and #Unjustice were trending, with people from all walks of life sharing stories about the man they knew, a kind neighbor, a loyal customer, a mentor to many. Unbeknownst to Marcus, the storm brewing outside the station was about to collide head-on with the truth of who he really was, and when it did, the consequences would ripple far beyond the walls of that interrogation room. YouTube transcript, intro section, host, voiceover. In the heart of the city, a man's quiet morning turns into a nightmare when two officers arrest him under suspicious circumstances. But who is Marcus Reed, and why does his identity leave an entire police station reeling? Stay tuned as we uncover a story of injustice, resilience, and redemption. But before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story touches you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales. The Silent Storm. The clock on the wall of the interrogation room ticked away with maddening precision, each second dragging Marcus Reed deeper into the surreal nightmare he was living. Sitting at the cold metal table, his wrists sore from the cuffs, Marcus maintained a calm demeanor, but inside, his thoughts raced. He knew this was more than a mistaken identity. This was systemic prejudice wearing a badge. Mitchell and Blake entered the room once again, this time holding a thin file. They seemed to relish the authority they wielded, their smirks full of condescension. Mitchell dropped the file onto the table with a theatrical thud and leaned over Marcus, trying to intimidate him. "We're going to ask you one more time," Mitchell began, his voice dripping with fox patience. "Where were you between 6:30 and 7 o'clock a.m. this morning?" Marcus sat up straighter, meeting Mitchell's gaze with unflinching resolve. "As I said earlier, I was at Louis' diner from about 7 o'clock a.m. onward. Check their surveillance footage. The staff can corroborate my story." Blake scoffed and leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Convenient, but we've got witnesses who claim they saw a man matching your description fleeing the scene of a robbery 2 blocks from here." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his voice steady but sharp. "Witnesses, or assumptions, because I've been walking these streets for years, and I've never been involved in anything criminal." Mitchell slammed his hands on the table, making the metal vibrate. "Enough with the attitude. We've got enough to hold you until we verify your story." Marcus remained calm, refusing to give them the reaction they wanted. "You mean to say you're holding me on suspicion with no evidence? Is that how justice works now?" The tension in the room was palpable, but Marcus knew he couldn't let anger or frustration cloud his judgment. He needed to stay composed, to outlast their games. They wanted him to crack, to show some sign of guilt, but he wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Meanwhile, outside the station, the storm was brewing. Louis, the diner owner, was livid. He had taken to social media, posting the video of Marcus being arrested along with a heartfelt message. "This is Marcus Reed, one of the kindest men I know. He's been wrongfully detained this morning, and I won't stand for it. The police claim he's a suspect in a crime, but I can vouch for him. He was in my diner the whole time they're talking about. This is injustice, plain and simple. Share this. Let's get him the help he deserves." The post went viral within hours, racking up thousands of shares and comments. People who knew Marcus, colleagues, friends, and even strangers who had crossed paths with him, poured in with their stories. One woman wrote, "Marcus gave me a job when I was down on my luck. He's a good man, not some criminal." Another added, "This is profiling, pure and simple. He deserves better." Among the growing chorus of voices, one name stood out: Evelyn Grant, a prominent civil rights attorney who had made headlines for taking on high-profile cases of police misconduct. Evelyn saw the post and was immediately drawn to Marcus's case. Something about his calm demeanor in the video, his sharp suit, and the injustice of the situation resonated with her. Evelyn picked up the phone and called Louis directly. "I want to help," she said. "Can you connect me with his family?" Louis didn't hesitate. His mother's number is in his phone, but they took that when they arrested him. Evelyn was already making notes. "Don't worry, I'll get through to them." Inside the station, Marcus was growing increasingly frustrated by the officers' refusal to provide concrete evidence. They left him in the interrogation room for hours at a time, hoping to wear him down. But Marcus was no stranger to adversity. He had faced challenges before, ones that tested his spirit and his resolve. And he wasn't about to let two officers break him now. He stared at the two-way mirror, knowing someone was likely watching him from the other side. His mind wandered to his mother, who was probably wondering why he hadn't responded to her texts. He thought of his employees at the nonprofit organization he ran, a group that worked tirelessly to mentor at-risk youth and provide scholarships for underprivileged students. He couldn't afford to let them down. Just as his thoughts began to spiral, the door opened again. This time, it wasn't Mitchell or Blake. A young officer, her expression softer and more uncertain, stepped into the room. "Mr. Reed," she began hesitantly, "do you need anything? Water? Something to eat?" Marcus tilted his head, surprised by the change in tone. "Water would be nice," he replied, his voice calm but guarded. The officer nodded and left the room, returning moments later with a bottle of water. As she set it on the table, she glanced at him, her voice low. "For what it's worth, I think this whole thing is wrong." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Then why don't you say something?" The officer hesitated, looking over her shoulder as if worried someone might overhear. "It's not that simple," she murmured before quickly leaving the room. Her words lingered in Marcus's mind. She wasn't an ally, but she wasn't an enemy either. It was a small crack in the fortress of hostility surrounding him, and Marcus knew how to exploit cracks. He just needed time. Evelyn Grant wasted no time. By early afternoon, she had made contact with Marcus's mother, Sylvia Reed, a retired schoolteacher who was both shocked and outraged by her son's arrest. Together, they stormed into the police station, Evelyn's sharp heels clicking against the tiled floor like a war drum. Sylvia's voice cut through the hum of the station. "Where is my son?" she demanded, her presence commanding attention. Mitchell appeared from the back, his smirk faltering slightly at the sight of Evelyn, whose reputation preceded her. "And who are you?" he asked, though the tension in his voice betrayed his unease. "I'm Evelyn Grant," she replied coolly, handing him a business card. "Mr. Reed's attorney. I'd like to see him immediately, and unless you want this to turn into a media circus, I suggest you cooperate." Mitchell hesitated but finally nodded. "Fine. Follow me." Sylvia turned to Evelyn as they walked down the hall. "Do you think they'll let him go?" Evelyn's expression was steely, not without a fight. But don't worry, I'm good at fighting. As the door to the interrogation room opened, and Marcus saw his mother and Evelyn walk in, a weight lifted from his shoulders. For the first time that day, he felt the tides beginning to turn. But what none of them knew was that the revelation of Marcus's true identity was about to send shockwaves through the entire station and beyond. The truth begins to unravel. The reunion with his mother brought a brief moment of solace for Marcus, but the tension in the room was unmistakable. His mother's eyes, filled with both anger and concern, bore into him as if searching for answers that could make sense of the situation. Evelyn Grant, the sharp and composed attorney, took a seat across from Marcus, setting her briefcase on the table with deliberate precision. "I'm sorry this is happening to you, Mr. Reed," Evelyn began, her voice measured. "But I promise we're going to get you out of here. First, I need to know everything that happened." Marcus recounted the morning's events in detail, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. He described the officer's hostility, the baseless accusations, and the hours of being left alone in the interrogation room. As he spoke, Evelyn jotted down notes, her sharp eyes darting occasionally toward the two-way mirror. "Classic intimidation tactics," Evelyn muttered. "They're stalling, hoping to break you." Marcus nodded. "It's not the first time I faced something like this, but it's the first time it's gone this far. I didn't even get my phone call." Sylvia, sitting beside Marcus, placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "We'll get through this," she said firmly. "You've always been stronger than they give you credit for." Evelyn looked up from her notes. "Do you have any enemies? Anyone who might want to see you in this position?" Marcus shook his head. "None that I can think of. My life is pretty low profile. I run a nonprofit, I mentor kids, I keep my head down." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "Nonprofit? What kind of work do you do?" Marcus leaned back slightly, his expression softening. "It's called Pathways to Success. We work with at-risk youth, providing mentorship programs, scholarships, and job training. It's not glamorous, but it's meaningful." Sylvia interjected, her voice filled with pride. "He's being modest. That nonprofit has helped hundreds of kids stay off the streets and build real futures." Evelyn's pen paused. "That's good to know. It'll be important when we frame your character in the court of public opinion, if it comes to that." Just then, the door to the interrogation room swung open. Mitchell and Blake entered, their confident smirks dimmed slightly by the sight of Evelyn. Mitchell's gaze darted to Sylvia, and he seemed momentarily unnerved by her stern, unyielding expression. "Who's this?" Mitchell asked, gesturing toward Evelyn. "Evelyn Grant," she said, standing and extending a hand. "Marcus Reed's attorney. And you are?" Mitchell ignored the handshake, crossing his arms. "We're still conducting our investigation." Evelyn didn't flinch. "You've been investigating for hours, yet my client hasn't been charged with a crime. That's a violation of his rights, and I intend to hold you accountable." Mitchell scoffed, but Evelyn's unwavering stare made him shift uncomfortably. "We're just doing our job," he muttered. "And I'm doing mine," Evelyn shot back. "I'd like to see the evidence you claim to have against Mr. Reed. Surveillance footage, witness statements, anything to justify this detention." Blake stepped forward, his smirk returning. "We don't have to share that with you yet. This isn't court." Evelyn tilted her head, her voice calm but laced with steel. "You're correct. It's not court. But if you continue to hold my client without evidence, I'll make sure this station is flooded with reporters by sundown. And trust me, I'm very good at getting the media's attention." The tension in the room was electric. Mitchell clenched his jaw, clearly debating his next move. Finally, he gestured for Blake to follow him. "We'll be back," he said, his tone clipped. As the door closed behind them, Evelyn turned back to Marcus. "They're bluffing. They don't have anything concrete." Marcus sighed. "I hope you're right. But I have a feeling there's more to this than they're letting on." Outside the interrogation room, the police station was in chaos. Louis' social media post had set off a firestorm, and a crowd had gathered outside the building, holding signs and chanting for Marcus's release. News vans lined the street, reporters clamoring for updates. The hashtag Justice for Marcus was trending nationwide, and public pressure was mounting. Among the protesters were some of the young men and women Marcus had mentored through pathways to success. One of them, a college freshman named Jamal, held a sign that read, "Marcus Reed saved my life. Let him go." Jamal spoke to a local reporter, his voice trembling with emotion. "Marcus isn't just a mentor. He's like a father to me. He believed in me when no one else did. This isn't justice. It's a travesty." The station's commanding officer, Captain Ramirez, watched the scene unfold from his office window, his brow furrowed. He was a seasoned leader who prided himself on running a fair and disciplined precinct, but this situation was spiraling out of control. He hadn't approved Marcus's detention and was furious to learn about it after the fact. Ramirez called Mitchell and Blake into his office. "Explain to me why we're holding Marcus Reed," he demanded, his voice like thunder. Mitchell hesitated. "Sir, he matches the description of a suspect in a robbery." "Spare me the excuses," Ramirez snapped. "Have you verified the surveillance footage from the diner? Have you spoken to witnesses who can confirm his alibi?" Mitchell looked away, mumbling something incoherent. Ramirez's eyes narrowed. "That's what I thought. Release him. Now." Blake stepped forward, his voice defiant. "With all due respect, Captain, we were just doing our job." "Your job," Ramirez said, his voice low and dangerous, "is to serve and protect, not to profile and harass. Get him out of that interrogation room before I have both of your badges on my desk." Mitchell and Blake exchanged a glance but didn't argue. They left the office, their expressions sour. Back in the interrogation room, Marcus and his mother were discussing the media coverage when the door opened once again. This time, Captain Ramirez entered, his expression calm but serious. "Mr. Reed," Ramirez began, "I want to personally apologize for what you've been put through today. You're free to go." Sylvia stood, her eyes narrowing. "An apology? That's all he gets after hours of mistreatment?" Ramirez nodded, his tone sincere. "I understand your frustration, ma'am, and I assure you we'll be conducting a full review of this incident. But for now, I just want to make sure Mr. Reed gets home safely." Marcus stood, his shoulders straight. "I appreciate your apology, Captain. But this isn't just about me. This is about the system that allows things like this to happen." Ramirez met his gaze. "You're right. And I intend to address it." As Marcus left the station with Evelyn and Sylvia, the crowd outside erupted into cheers. Cameras flashed, and reporters shouted questions, but Marcus ignored them, his focus on the road ahead. Little did he know, the truth about his identity, something he had kept private for years, was about to come to light in a way that would shake the very foundation of the city. The revelation. Marcus stepped out into the glaring sunlight, his freedom a stark contrast to the hours of confinement and scrutiny he had just endured. The crowd outside the station parted as he emerged, their cheers resonating through the air. Despite their enthusiasm, Marcus felt the weight of the ordeal pressing down on him. His calm demeanor never wavered, but inside, he knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Sylvia held his arm protectively, her motherly instincts on full display as she ushered him toward Evelyn's car. "We'll talk at home," she whispered, her voice firm but gentle. Evelyn, walking beside them, kept her composure despite the chaos. "Marcus," she said once they were in the car, "you need to prepare for what comes next. The media is going to dig into your life, and once they find out who you really are, this will escalate." Marcus gave her a sidelong glance. "What do you mean by who I really am?" Evelyn smiled knowingly. "Let's not play coy, Mr. Reed. I did my homework while I was waiting for them to let me see you. I know about your background, the connections you've kept quiet." Marcus sighed, leaning his head against the car window as the vehicle merged into traffic. He wasn't ashamed of his past, but he had made a deliberate choice to live his life without leveraging it. That decision, however, was no longer his to control. Hours later, in the quiet sanctuary of his mother's living room, Marcus sat with Evelyn and Sylvia, discussing the next steps. Outside, reporters had begun to gather, their presence a reminder that privacy was now a luxury he could no longer afford. Evelyn leaned forward, her hands clasped. "Marcus, we need to address the elephant in the room. If we don't take control of the narrative, someone else will." Sylvia nodded, her expression a mix of pride and concern. "It's time, son. The world needs to know who you are." Marcus looked between them, his jaw tightening. He had spent years crafting a life where his actions spoke louder than his name, but now it seemed the name he had tried so hard to distance himself from was the key to exposing the injustice he had faced. "Fine," he said finally. "Let's tell the truth." The next morning, Marcus sat in front of a camera, Evelyn by his side. They had decided to release a statement, not to defend him but to shed light on the broader issues at play. The room was quiet as Evelyn adjusted her notes, the hum of the recording equipment the only sound. Marcus took a deep breath, his hands resting on the table. When the camera light turned red, signaling it was recording, he looked directly into the lens. "My name is Marcus Reed," he began, his voice steady. "Yesterday, I was unjustly detained by officers who claimed I matched the description of a suspect in a robbery. Despite providing evidence of my whereabouts, I was treated as guilty until proven innocent. A treatment that is, unfortunately, far too common for black men in this country." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "What those officers didn't know is that I'm not just any man walking down the street. I've worked tirelessly to build a life of service, running a nonprofit organization that has helped hundreds of young people find purpose and success. But beyond that, there's something else they didn't know, something that has been a part of my life since birth." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his tone calm but powerful. "My full name is Marcus Alexander Reed, son of William Reed, a federal judge who spent his career fighting for civil rights. My father's legacy is one of justice, equality, and unyielding dedication to the principles this country was built on. And while I've chosen to walk my own path, that legacy is a part of who I am." The revelation hung in the air, the weight of his words undeniable. Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength. "What happened to me isn't just about one man being wrongfully detained. It's about a system that allows bias and prejudice to dictate the actions of those sworn to protect and serve. I won't let this experience go unnoticed, and I won't let it happen to anyone else if I can help it." Evelyn nodded subtly as he finished, her eyes gleaming with approval. The recording ended, and the video was immediately uploaded to every platform imaginable. Within hours, it went viral, sparking a national conversation. Back at the police station, the fallout was swift. Captain Ramirez held a press conference, addressing the public outcry. Standing at a podium, he spoke directly to the cameras. "First and foremost, I want to apologize to Marcus Reed for the treatment he received at our station. An internal investigation is underway, and the officers involved have been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. This incident highlights a deeper issue within our department and policing as a whole, one that we are committed to addressing." The reporters fired questions, but Ramirez held his ground, refusing to let the narrative spiral out of control. However, he knew this was only the beginning. The revelations about Marcus's background had turned what might have been a local scandal into a national reckoning. Meanwhile, Marcus found himself at the center of a whirlwind. Messages poured in from strangers expressing support, from journalists requesting interviews, and from prominent figures offering solidarity. The nonprofit he had built, Pathways to Success, saw an outpouring of donations, enabling it to expand its reach. But for Marcus, the most meaningful responses came from the young people he had mentored. Jamal, the college freshman who had spoken to reporters outside the station, sent him a heartfelt message. Mr. Reed, you've always told us to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. Watching you do that now makes me believe we can all make a difference." Marcus smiled as he read the message, his resolve strengthening. This wasn't just about his story. It was about creating a ripple effect that would inspire others to challenge injustice and demand better. Late that night, Marcus stood on the balcony of his apartment, staring out at the city skyline. The events of the past 48 hours had changed everything, but they had also given him a renewed sense of purpose. He had always believed in the power of quiet action, but now he understood the value of raising his voice. As the city lights twinkled in the distance, Marcus made a silent vow. He would use his platform, his name, and his story to push for real, lasting change. And he wouldn't stop until the system that had tried to break him was reformed from the ground up. A call for justice. The days following Marcus Reed's release were a whirlwind of activity. His statement had sparked a national conversation about racial profiling, systemic bias, and the urgent need for police reform. While Marcus had anticipated some level of attention, he was unprepared for the sheer scale of the response. He had gone from being a quiet community leader to a public figure in a matter of hours. The video of his statement had amassed millions of views, and news outlets scrambled to cover the story. Talk shows, podcasts, and social media platforms buzzed with debates about what Marcus's experience represented. Some called him a hero. Others labeled him a disruptor of the status quo. But Marcus wasn't interested in labels. He was interested in solutions. One afternoon, Marcus sat in his living room, surrounded by piles of letters, emails, and messages that his nonprofit staff had printed for him. The stories people shared were heartbreaking and powerful. Tales of wrongful arrests, lives upended by prejudice, and communities torn apart by systemic inequality. Sylvia, ever the loving mother, sat nearby, sifting through the letters with him. "These people are looking to you for hope," she said softly. "They see you as someone who can make things better." Marcus nodded, his brow furrowed in thought. "I never asked to be a symbol, Mom, but maybe it's time to embrace it. If my story can help others, I have to step up." Evelyn Grant walked in, carrying a tablet loaded with news articles. "You're not just a symbol anymore, Marcus. You're a movement. Look at this." She handed him the tablet, showing him an op-ed in a prominent national newspaper titled Marcus Reed, The Catalyst for Change. The article detailed Marcus's journey, his wrongful arrest, and his revelation about his father's legacy. It framed him as a modern-day champion for justice, someone uniquely positioned to bridge the gap between grassroots activism and institutional reform. Marcus set the tablet down, his expression serious. "If we're going to be a movement, we need a plan." Evelyn smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that." The town hall. Within days, Marcus and Evelyn organized a town hall meeting in the community center where Pathways to Success held its mentorship programs. Word spread quickly, and the turnout was overwhelming. People from all walks of life packed the auditorium, with many standing in the aisles or watching from overflow rooms. Marcus stood at the podium, scanning the crowd. Young and old, black and white, professionals and activists. They were all here, united by a common purpose. The energy in the room was electric, a mixture of hope and determination. He began his speech with a story from his youth. "When I was a kid, my father used to tell me, 'Marcus, justice isn't something you wait for. It's something you fight for.' Back then, I didn't fully understand what he meant. I thought justice was automatic, something that just happened if you followed the rules. But I've learned that justice is a choice, and too often, it's a choice people in power don't make." The room was silent, hanging on his every word. "What happened to me isn't unique," Marcus continued. "I'm standing here today because I had resources, a mother who raised me to be strong, a lawyer who believed in me, and a platform to share my story. But what about the countless others who don't have those things? What about the people who are silenced before they ever get a chance to speak?" Applause erupted, a wave of agreement washing over the room. Marcus raised his hands, calling for quiet. This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. If we want change, we have to demand it. We have to organize, educate, and hold people accountable. Evelyn stepped forward, addressing the practical side of their plan. We're launching a campaign called Justice Now, she announced. It's a multi-pronged initiative to combat racial profiling, advocate for police reform, and provide legal support to those who have been wrongfully detained or abused by the system. She outlined the campaign's goals, including pushing for body cameras in every precinct, mandatory bias training for officers, and the establishment of independent review boards to investigate police misconduct. When the floor opened for questions, a young woman stood up, her voice trembling. "Marcus, what can people like me do to help? I'm just a college student. I don't have much power." Marcus smiled warmly. "You have more power than you think. Start by sharing your voice. Join local advocacy groups, vote in every election, and hold your representatives accountable. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with people like you." The resistance. Not everyone was thrilled about Marcus's rising influence. Behind closed doors, detractors began to emerge, some within the police force and others in political circles. They viewed Marcus as a threat to the status quo, someone who was challenging deeply ingrained systems. Mitchell and Blake, the officers who had arrested Marcus, found themselves at the center of the department's internal investigation. While they were officially silent, leaks suggested they were bitter about the backlash, portraying themselves as victims of a media witch hunt. Their allies in the department quietly rallied to protect them, framing the situation as a misunderstanding rather than misconduct. Marcus knew that resistance was inevitable, but he refused to back down. "If they're pushing back," he told Evelyn, "it means we're hitting a nerve." The media spotlight. As the weeks passed, Marcus became a regular face on national news programs and talk shows. He used every opportunity to push for justice now, speaking passionately about the need for reform. During one particularly powerful interview, the host asked him, "Marcus, how do you stay so composed after everything you've been through?" Marcus thought for a moment before answering. "Because this isn't about me. It's about the people who don't get to tell their stories. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to someone else. If my calmness helps people listen, then I'll keep speaking." The interview went viral, further cementing Marcus's reputation as a leader who was both unshakable and compassionate. A glimmer of change. Back at Pathways to Success, Marcus found solace in his work. The nonprofit had expanded significantly since his ordeal, with new chapters opening in cities across the country. One evening, as he was leaving the office, a young boy approached him. "Mr. Reed?" the boy asked timidly. Marcus knelt to his level, smiling. "That's me. What's your name?" "Jeremiah," the boy said. "My mom told me about you. She said you help kids like me." Marcus felt a lump in his throat. "That's right, Jeremiah. What do you want to be when you grow up?" Jeremiah's eyes lit up. "A lawyer, like your friend Miss Evelyn. So I can help people." Marcus chuckled, ruffling the boy's hair. "You can do that, Jeremiah. And when you're ready, I'll be here to help you get there." As Jeremiah ran back to his mother, Marcus stood in the fading sunlight, his resolve stronger than ever. The fight for justice was far from over, but moments like this reminded him why it was worth it. The next chapter in his journey was just beginning. A legacy reclaimed. Months had passed since the day Marcus Reed was unjustly detained, and his name had become synonymous with a national reckoning. What had begun as a personal ordeal had transformed into a movement that ignited conversations about justice and systemic change. Justice Now, the initiative he and Evelyn Grant had launched, was gaining traction in communities and legislative halls alike. Yet Marcus knew the path ahead would not be easy. A meeting with power. One crisp autumn morning, Marcus and Evelyn found themselves standing outside the steps of Capitol Hill. They were there to meet with lawmakers, presenting Justice Now's proposed reforms to a bipartisan group of senators and representatives. The stakes were high. This was more than a symbolic meeting. It was an opportunity to enact real change. As they entered the grand hall, Evelyn leaned over to Marcus. "Stay focused. Some of these people will try to discredit you, but we have the facts on our side." Marcus nodded, adjusting his tie. "I've faced worse than skepticism, Evelyn. Let's do this." The meeting was tense from the start. While many lawmakers expressed support, a few voiced concerns about the feasibility of the proposed reforms. One senator, an older man with a perpetually furrowed brow, leaned back in his chair, his tone skeptical. "Mr. Reed," he began, "your story is compelling, no doubt. But are you suggesting that systemic racism is the driving force behind every police misstep? Isn't that a bit extreme?" Marcus didn't flinch. He had anticipated such questions and prepared himself for them. "Senator," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I'm not here to demonize law enforcement. I'm here to shine a light on a system that allows bias to go unchecked. When policies don't address these biases, they perpetuate harm. This isn't about blaming individuals. It's about creating a system that's fair for everyone." The senator's expression softened slightly, but he didn't respond. Instead, a younger representative spoke up, her tone supportive. "Mr. Reed, I've reviewed your proposal, and I think it's both reasonable and necessary. Body cameras, independent review boards, and mandatory bias training aren't just reforms. They're safeguards for everyone." The meeting ended after hours of heated discussion, but Marcus and Evelyn walked away with a glimmer of hope. Several lawmakers had pledged their support, promising to champion justice now in upcoming sessions. It was a step forward, but Marcus knew the battle was far from over. A shadow from the past. As Marcus's profile grew, so did the scrutiny. While many rallied behind his cause, detractors searched for any means to undermine his credibility. One evening, as Marcus prepared for a community rally, Evelyn walked into his office with a concerned expression. "You need to see this," she said, handing him a tablet. Marcus's heart sank as he read the headline. "The Untold Scandals of the Reed Family." The article dug into his father's career, questioning his rulings and alleging financial improprieties, claims that had been debunked years earlier but were now being dredged up as a smear campaign against Marcus. He set the tablet down, his jaw tightening. "They'll stop at nothing, will they?" Evelyn placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "They're threatened by you, Marcus. That means you're doing something right." Still, the attack stung. Marcus had always revered his father, William Reed, as a man of integrity and principle. Seeing his legacy tarnished, even temporarily, was a painful reminder of how personal this fight had become. A rally for unity. That night, Marcus addressed a packed crowd at the community center, the energy in the room palpable. He stood before them, not as a victim, but as a leader determined to fight for justice. "I won't pretend this journey has been easy," Marcus began, his voice resonating through the hall. "There are those who want to silence us, to make us question our worth and our purpose. But let me tell you something, they can dig up all the dirt they want. It won't stop us." The crowd erupted into applause, their voices rising in a chant. "Justice now! Justice now!" Marcus raised his hands, calling for quiet. "This isn't about me. It's about us. It's about the communities that deserve better, the children who deserve to grow up without fear, and the officers who deserve a system that supports fairness and accountability. This fight is bigger than any one person. It's a fight for the soul of this nation." As he stepped off the stage, Marcus felt a wave of resolve wash over him. The road ahead would be long, but he wasn't walking it alone. The personal sacrifices. Despite his public success, the personal toll was undeniable. Marcus rarely had time for himself, and his relationship with his mother, Sylvia, had shifted. She was proud of him, but she worried about the stress he carried. One evening, as they shared a quiet dinner at her home, she reached across the table, taking his hand. "Marcus, you can't save the world by yourself." He looked at her, his expression weary. "I know, Mom, but I have to try." Sylvia smiled gently. Just don't forget to take care of yourself, too. The world needs you, but I need you too." Her words stayed with Marcus, a reminder of the balance he had to maintain between his mission and his humanity. Victory and vigilance. Months turned into a year, and progress began to take shape. Legislation inspired by justice now passed in several states, mandating police reforms that had once seemed unattainable. Communities reported improved relations with law enforcement, and Marcus's nonprofit expanded its programs, reaching more youth than ever before.